All right. Thanks for being here, talking with Sean B.W. Parker. I guess I could have thrown a Cheerio in there, but that might seem a little cheap. But writer, poet, I think maybe singer, editor, speaker. What are you doing, or what's taking up most of your time these days?
Hi, thank you. Right now, I'm very much preoccupied with art, as in the piece behind me. And also, I've got an album coming out next week called Caucasian Nights. So I'm quite excited to be promoting that as well.
Okay. What's the art piece there?
This one is it's an interpretation of a photo that actually it's of a club that I'm a member, and the other people in it are artists themselves, and so I was sketching them, took a photo of that, and then took it home and expanded it into this color piece, and it's a modernist arrangement, I suppose. It's very hard to talk about your own art when you've done it yourself about a couple of months ago. It's very big.
Is it on?
It goes up to
is it on
ceiling,
canvas?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it a canvas?
Yeah, it's a thick canvas.
Acrylic or oil?
But that's it.
Okay.
It's acrylic with some charcoal and some ink as well.
Okay.
Have
you just started into that type of art, or have you been doing that a while?
I've been doing it about 25 years. I actually did a master's degree in fine art. That was art school days, around the millennium, and after that I've done lots of other things, but there's art in the middle of it all.
So then has it something that you started back then and kept going the whole time, or are you kind of rediscovering it lately?
The good thing about painting is that it can come back into it at certain parts of your life. So if other things are busy or you don't have space or time, it's just there in the back of your mind. And when I get a chance, I'm going to do a painting or a drawing. So then when you get a little space, like here we are post-COVID and all that kind of thing, it's like, right, I'm going to do a bunch of things I've been planning and wanting to do. And so I for some reason, over the last couple of years, I've just got a real thing back in for the art. I'm not quite sure why. Mysteries of the mind.
Where do you think that does that come up like writing, where you're thinking about it a while and then it just eventually gets to the point where it's like it's got to come out, so you have to write it? Or is it different with painting?
With the writing, there are certain themes that seem to be really important. So it's kind of writing about the world from your own perspective. With a painting, it's just a bit more of a how am I doing that now, and how can I do it a bit better or a bit bigger on a different scale. So what I do is take the last thing I did in writing and painting, and then to go to which directions can I push that this time, and you've accrued the learning inside you, so you don't agonize that too much. It's just in you, and then you get on with what you can do next. So you end up on this sort of scale, or you end up having written a book or something like that. And that's the creative process for me. Sort of, it doesn't have to be size, but I do tend to go bigger and bigger each time, because why not?
Okay. I'm reminded of I don't know if it actually happened in history, but maybe something like it on I think it was the HBO series about Henry V. I think it was Henry V, where it was talking about where he had the self-portrait done, and he had the self-portrait done when he was older and maybe not in as good a shape as he was the younger him. And the artist draws it, and in the show, he comes in and looks at it, and it looks like the classic Henry V, Henry VIII, whichever one that had Henry VIII with the lance wound in his leg that never quite healed, right? And he looks at it and goes, "Is this what I look like to you?" And he's yelling about it and everything. And then he goes, "Do it again." And then the artist works on it, some shows longer or whatever. And he brings him in and presents it to him the next time. And it's a huge painting, like the wall from the floor to the ceiling. And it's of him when he was younger. And it just looks like that. And he's like, "Yes, you've captured it." So I
It's a
wonder if that's
vanity at work.
I wonder if that's part of the going bigger. It's just, or is it you just need space to capture the whole idea?
I suppose it's just it's like a domination thing in a way. If you have a massive piece of work, then you're kind of taking it beyond the human scale into a more superhuman scale. So you're taking away that conversational aspect. That's what I feel when I go and see big pieces by other artists. You're not really looking at them anymore or their reputation. You're looking at this wall that they've produced. And so yes, it's a kind of it's a sense of the domination there in the that could sound a bit dodgy, but it's just meant to be about artistic identity swamping the audience. It's just a phase to play with. If you've been to see a Rothko ever, I'm sure you know they are enormous. Just the blocks of color though, without any detail, but it's like a religious experience looking at them because they're so dominating of the space.
Oh, okay. So maybe that thing Melville said about in Moby Dick, the chapter, The Tale, where he talks about what size imbues or imposes, just talking about the tail of the whale and how enormous it is. It's people should check that out. Read that chapter. It's not that long. It's like a page or two. But it's a good quote in there. Yeah. So I noticed in your material that you do poems, or you have poems on criminal justice that came out in 2023. What kind of is that true?
Slightly. There's been a couple of poems that I published last year, but there's a whole book of them coming out this year, and they're not out yet. So they'll be coming out in a couple of months. Maybe I should have put that clear.
So what started you on poems of criminal justice?
Just over the last couple of years, I've been a writer on justice reform, for Empowering the Innocent and for certain other reform agencies over here. And I've been touched by lots of the culture war stories in the media. And so I have interpreted a lot of those impressions and feelings about what's going on with things, especially around the time of COVID and everything else, and Black Lives Matter too, and things like this. And because we had a lot of that in Britain, and I've put, and they all seem to come out into these poems in the same way of that they would in the other things that I do, and they were considered quite high grade by a publisher. So he's gathered them all, and it will be coming out in September or so.
Oh, okay. Well, very nice. What kind of style would you call your poetry?
They're impressionistic. Again, they can be sort of surreal, but often they can tell a story as well. I don't ever take a subject head on in any of my art, really. You never know, oh, that's what he's doing, because I prefer an oblique strategy, because there's much more layers then to think about. So these poems are like that too. So, you know, I could be talking about a game of pool, but I'll actually be talking about the Syrian war, for example. So, you know, that's a metaphor in poetry and in allegory. Did that answer your question? I can't actually remember what your exact question was there, but it was around that, wasn't it?
What you would call your style of writing? Would you call it like free verse, or is it rhyming or pentameter, or how would you call it?
Oh, Right. Okay. Yeah. It's not that traditional. Often people who like classic poetry have a read and go, well, that's a bit weird for me. But there is
Mm,
a structure to them. You just can't necessarily see the structure because it's not 1 2 1 2, rhymic like that often. I've got a couple like that, but that's not my normal style. It starts off as a free verse type thing, like a prose, like a kind of Kerouac riff, for example, over a page, and then I sculpt it into various musical feeling movements,
okay.
trying to keep the meaning in there, and the visual is. I suppose that's where the craft is, to make sure you've got a balance of impact and good language. It, weird talking about poetry. I'll have to send you a couple next time we
Mm.
meet afterwards.
In my experience, when you get a poetry or a poet to start reading poetry, it's hard to get them to shut up because I think the connection is so great with the work that the emotion is there when you're reliving it, and you, as reading the poetry that you've written, you want that other person to understand what it means to you, but it oftentimes means something totally different to someone else. And you could explain this line means this means this means this. But I think that's one of the great things about poetry is it takes on a life of its own. So
Mm,
strange poetry I like, and free verse is good with me. The rhyming
mm.
stuff is okay, and every now and then when I write, I have a little bit of rhyme, but free verse I think is the way to go. More of a Emily Dickens type poetry.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, man. That's very, very, very interestingly put, because not a lot of people get it. Um, I don't often talk to English literature graduates about this stuff because they tend to be too steeped in the historical and certain rules and politics and stuff, which I'm not. I don't share. So
Mm.
I actually like quite a lot of American poets, to be honest. Also, Mr. Dylan Thomas is my main man, and over
Okay.
here, Mr. T.S. Eliot as well. Dylan Thomas did kind of come over to the US in the 50s, and he actually died there, didn't he? New
I
York.
think so. Yeah.
Yeah. But Walt Whitman is he really touched me in my 20s, and I'm like, wow, and he kept me going. Walt Whitman with the uh, the naturalistic stuff, and
Mm.
the Ezra Pound, fantastic stuff. I think that's how it's pronounced. And so
Mhm.
a couple of those mid 50s expressionistic beat poets, I guess, are big to me as well. I read everything and yeah, try and suck it all in.
Yeah, the Leaves of Grass is interesting how he just kept adding to it and adding to it. It's I think it was the nature of the time, and maybe of a poet too. It feels like you write something and then you say this is a completed collection of poetry, and then you write some more and you're like, well, this may go with that. It also could be its own thing. But I think back then it was just easier to keep adding it to the book to make it bigger, and then you're kind of you're adding to the hits, and then you're also getting more out there. So maybe from a sales standpoint, it's better for the poet and better for the printer. And I think these days it's easier to break down books into different collections, and you don't have to go back and add to things like you did with Leaves of Grass, just putting everything in there over and over, or adding to it
Mm.
as he went on. But I do like Oh Mio Life is it's a classic. It's a good one.
Mm.
Be on my top poetry ones.
Is that by whom?
Whitman.
Whitman. Okay, so I didn't know Ezra Pound was. So I'm not that
Yeah.
deep into American stuff.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
I'll have a listen later on.
Well, there was the revolution, so maybe
So, well, yeah, quite.
when you write poetry, do you sit down and say, "Okay, I'm going to write a poem now," or does it strike you at different times and you just have to go with it when you feel it?
I think I'm actually quite good at sort of turning it on and off. Like I've got a notebook in which I keep all ideas that come to me in bed or in the shower, whatever, and I scroll them down in the back of this book. And then when I have time and inclination and positive feeling, I go into it and start to play with it and start to work it, And yeah, I think the older I get, the better I am at organizing my time as well. You get more organized, don't you? And so I'm like, right, now I can do this and I can spare this time for this. And then like this other thing's coming later. Do you have to get on with ordinary life as well as the creative bit here anyway?
Yeah.
So yeah.
I do that a lot with poetry as well. Is I think I could sit down and write it if I wanted to. And oftentimes after you have all those thoughts that occurred at different times, whenever they occur, for me, it's usually somewhere with water around. I think negative ions and something would be the scientific explanation of why water occurs, but like swimming or running or shower, and then that time right before sleep, but not awake. And then sometimes you get the ideas from the dream and you have to wake up and write it down or put it in the phone so you don't forget it. And then you end up with a huge document of just lines of things that you're like, man, I don't know if this goes together or this goes together. What process do you use to organize those thoughts when you have that big pile of different ideas?
What a great question. Look at them, and I suppose it's just an element of art coming into it here, and intelligence, and the subjects that will clash together nicely, and how the sentence runs. And if it doesn't, you can feel it. So repeat it again. Make sure it's got something that hooks. And you can't always just describe how something feels, but the sentence feels right, or the verse then feels right. And that's just the chipping away. And it is indeed easier these days with Microsoft Word and stuff. So the chipping is less pieces of paper and glasses of wine and a bit more, laptop and the same thing. So that's all right. There's no massive loss of the romance with that. It's a fine thing to do. It's the same process really. Once you just becomes a bit more practical. So yeah, I hear though something behind what you said in that it might not be a good idea to totally sculpt away all of the free verse, because the free verse itself is the positive thing, isn't it? It's like that expressionism is the value of it. So you don't want to get rid of all of that spontaneity.
I find it's the magic of poetry, I guess, is when you have all those ideas, and oftentimes I can do it on a computer if it's not too many. Like if I block it out and I put a time and a date and I have these thoughts, I put it down, and then maybe later close to that time, or if I take a moment and then try to add to it a little bit more, that I can come back later and it's a more unified, or it makes more sense to me if I look at it a little bit after. So you get farther back from it. And then sometimes it's just so overwhelming, the amount of information you have, that you have things you've written down in one spot, things you have on your phone in another, and then you put it all into one Word document and print it out, and you have 20 pages and you're like, man, I didn't realize it was going to be this much. And what I usually do then is I'll take the sections, because usually if I write something and I think this is a piece that's going to start or stand on its own, then I'll put the date and the time with it, just because that's how I order the ideas. Because then I can look back when you read them. And a lot of my poetry books, when I put them together, they're in chronological order. Maybe I'll move one or two around because it has more to do with this subject than this subject, but usually it's just chronologically. But I'll take that big document and then cut it into lines, like take some scissors and cut each line out, and then put them somewhere where there's not a lot of wind, because it's going to blow around. And I'll lay those out and then just move them around and look at them in different things. And I think that magic of poetry there is where you move something to a certain place and you're like, oh, that's where that goes. I wrote it a week apart or a year apart, but that's definitely where it goes. And then another piece and another piece, and you build the poem that way. But it does seem like, for me, poetry the more you exercise it, that ability to see it, write it, feel it, that the easier it gets, but also the more confidence you get in. Like first starting, I thought, am I going to be able, after I did the first poetry book, I was like, well, I might be finished with poetry now. That's just it for poetry. I'm not going to do poetry anymore. But I had set so much time aside each day to do it that it felt empty in the day if I didn't do it. So I found myself, okay, I'll do one more year of trying to do some poems, 10 poems a month. And then the next year, the same thing happens. And then this is the first year from 3 that I was like, well, I'm not going to set a goal of writing a certain amount of poems a month. But I think if I look back at my notes, there's enough to collect 10 poems. But for that magic of poetry, where do you think that idea comes from? Where do you think the thoughts and the rhythm and the tone of the poetry comes from for you?
I suppose there's something in the right brain of most of the creatives that I've ever met, in that when we're doing the poetry, we're kind of the right brain's popping with ideas and the left brain's organizing them into the poetry, according to many neurologists, okay, because they've watched them popping. Why is that bit more busy? Is that God-given or the nature-given or parents' DNA, all of those things? And, well, it's the same thing as nature. Where does that come from? I guess it's in the spark of life. It says, I'm going to create a kid who can barely count, guilty, but who's very, very good at English, and that's what you're given. To analyze it too much doesn't help much. It's interesting, but it's very hard to know. Both of my parents were extremely into English. I am. Is it because I've read a lot of it growing up? Maybe that definitely helps. So you're getting all those things together makes you want to create that. But like you mentioned about things getting better, you're getting better at it. You can't plan for that. That's just a wonderful discovery. I thought like the punk thing of like when you're young, it's exciting and you get worse and worse and worse as you get older. With writing, it's almost the complete opposite. I was a mediocre sort of lyric sort of writer as a teen, and now consider myself professional in writing because of practice. Practice, you get better, and it's hard to admit, isn't it? Because it's not very spontaneous. The fact is, when you do 10,000 words, you become much, much better.
Yeah. Maybe it's the experience, so you have more to draw from than you would when you're like, everybody always talks about finding your voice, but if you don't have anything to say, it's hard to find your voice. And if you haven't experienced anything, then you probably don't have anything to say.
Well, it's a difficult one for them, isn't it? I mean, that's the kids, and it's not that they don't have things to say because they can experience the world online in a way that in our youth it would have been different. And for what it is, we weren't able to do this sort of 30 years ago, were we? So it's wonderful, but at the same time, you're like, what can they be talking about? And they're going to go and spank the world with their ideas anyway, their outraged ideas. And you want to go and live something, but you don't want to patronize at the same time, and you don't want to take away that spirit, which is where rock and roll spirit comes from, is them being like that, and you don't want to control it too much, but it's difficult to get the value out of it that you really want, which is multi-layered. I just like any kind of art creation. I like it to be multi-layered, not just in my face,
Have you ever visualized or thought about the origins of creativity and ideas? And if so, what do you imagine that to be like?
I certainly hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned, in a way to come up with any sort of answer. It's quite into psychology, like I mentioned, but What do you think?
I have two main views of how I see creativity. And for poetry, to me, I visualize it as you're creating poetry out of your own experience. So it's coming from within you. And you're also an antenna for other things. Like you can maybe through empathy, you feel or try to feel or see things from other people's perspectives. So that's coming from outside of you. And then I think there's a more ethereal, maybe otherworldly place where poetry and creativity comes from. But for me, it's more, I feel it with poetry than anything else. And I visualize it as a dark forest that divides the worlds. And if you are showing up to write poetry, or if you're open to hearing it or discovering it, that you're kind of going into that place between worlds sometimes. Now, all poetry I don't think is like that, but some can be like that. And you're in this dark forest where it's a barrier between worlds. Like I don't know if you want to say angels or other realities or whatever. There's something else there, and they can't come through to your side and you can't go through to their side. But that middle ground of that forest is a place where both can kind of reach each other. So you're getting the feelings and ideas from them. They might be getting it from you too. So it's that exchange of ideas, and then you end up with some sort of something. And that comes across as strange poetry to me. I mean, that's the free verse where people look at it and go, I have no idea what you're talking about. But if you explained what it was to you, they would go, okay, I see that. But as I said before, I don't like explaining it so much to people, because if it means something to them, I don't want to ruin their perspective of it, because it's their art. To me, is the individual or the perspective's view and how it makes them feel. So I don't want to interrupt it. So I do feel like a lot of poetry is working through me as more of a filter than it is me coming up with an idea and writing it. And I talk about it a lot, the way the Romans saw genius, which was the Romans see genius as from outside of you. If they saw something and said, that's genius, they're not saying you're genius. They're saying that something is operating through you, and that's the genius working on that. That's one way I look at it.
That's very interesting. No, really, really interesting explanation. And I think that he's a genius stuff is very much of a humanist kind of post-classical Enlightenment thinking about taking it away from God and onto man, which has had its benefits. You know, it's been good, been fun, but also when you actually make the stuff, as you mentioned, you don't really have the same authorship. You know, where did that come from? I don't know. You know, I did some work to help it, like a midwife, you know, and yeah, but audience aren't really interested in that. So there's no point in laboring it. They want you to have done it and then to go, it's genius, and that genius made it. Like, well, whatever you want, fine. You know, I certainly don't see it that way either.
I don't do much painting, like artistic painting, outside of like painting a house or something. But when the few times where I have visually drawn things, like I just felt like this is how this piece of creativity or this idea needs to be expressed. It's less in it's I guess it's more abstract, but not abstract in the sense of modern art abstract, but more of like waves, coming back to the water, I guess, waves and lines and different colors. And I guess I can't do the picture part of it because I haven't exercised that part. I'm not a trained artist, or I don't have that natural ability to be able to draw things as we see them in reality. But I have had a few memorable times where I've drawn something and go, okay, now I understand a little better of the impressionist work or the abstract work where they say this picture is talking about this, or if you look at a collage that is more modern art and the person's like, yes, this is what this means, this is this, and you're like, oh, okay, all right. Before I may have thought 20 years ago, I may have looked at that and said, that's just a collage, man. But now I can look at it and say, all right, maybe there's some artistic input going on there, whether it's the individual, they think it's them, it's something working through them and they don't understand it, or they do understand it. So I do have a little more appreciation for the strange art, still Dada and stuff like that. I don't know if I'm sold on it yet. You just have the white canvas and put a dot on it and then Dada. But it's have you thought about where your visual art muse comes from versus your written art or your poetry or songs? And do you think it's from the same place, or do you think it manifests differently?
Yeah, I was just thinking about that as you were talking about your process, in that they are all part of the same core of expression, and this is the best part of going out into the world, as far as I'm concerned. It's not just being; it's also producing. I enjoy producing, and I have to acknowledge that in myself. There we go. It's what I want to do. Don't be ashamed of it in some sort of anti-capitalist sense. It's like produce, make it. With the painting, with the artwork itself, I do get lost in it. I start it and I'm lost, and it's a very joyful place, as you know, to be lost in the daydream and to be making, and that hours or possibly weeks in chunks, as it goes through. This took 6 weeks of different chunks of time, hour here and an hour there, that kind of thing. And a book, of course, will, because you're putting together like this sculpture of words. It's not just like sitting down, and for me, it's not sitting down and writing chapter after chapter. I can't do that. I don't know any writer who's ever done that. It's putting something together over weeks and months. Back to the art, it's like that place where you get lost, and I am not thinking about the result. That's what I'll say about my artwork. I'm never thinking about the result with it. I'm going until the artist to say that's done, that's finished. That's very hard to do, and that's always exciting. And if you think you might be done, definitely finish, and then come back to it the next day or a week later with those new eyes. It's so interesting every single time. Anything you make, song, poem, artwork, and go, oh, that's what I've made. Someone's going to like it, and it's intriguing to me. So yeah, that's the difference for me.
Yeah, it's fun doing it and then coming back and reading it or looking at it and going, yeah, I like that. It's resonating with me. So most likely it'll resonate with someone else. And if you're in the market of like getting your art out there or marketing it or selling it or whatever, then the hard part is just finding the other person it resonates with.
Well, there's a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah. How often do you write poetry?
These days, it seems to be about once a month. I will go, let's get those ideas together and see what they say. Like I was saying earlier, because time is, we're time poor, if anything, structuring things. When a bunch of things are done, it's like, I haven't done a poem for a while, so I'm going to have a look at a poem now. It's a pragmatic thing in a sense, and to keep the flow. And then you sort of think it's going to be a bit naff because I'm just like getting ideas together and hoping for the best. And I know it's actually quite good because it's something, because of the thing you were talking about earlier with the arrangements and I've gone back to something which wasn't like a passion to write as it might have been when I was 25. It's more like now, what can I put together to make happen of this new stuff? And so lots of the old ideas are done and expressed, and they were quite kind of copyist, quite a lot of them. I don't do copyist ideas anymore. I don't know about you, but all of the old interpretations of other people, copying a Whitman or a Thomas or a Picasso, it's not about that anymore. It's about, as it has been at times in the past, how can I get as close to that as I can? Now it's just about what can I do? and you've absorbed all that stuff into you, haven't you? So whichever part comes out as it should.
Yeah, I do find myself paying, I don't know if you'd say homage to other things. And I don't know if anybody else would ever pick up on it, but I do have a poem that I used O in, just the O with the apostrophe, just because that's what Whitman did and what people back then, how they talked. So, and I think Thomas Wolfe also did a little bit of that. So I put that in there. And then every now and then I'll have a semicolon in writing like a book where the thought is there, then I do a semicolon, and then I continue on with the thought. But there's this whole pages and pages of explanation that I've taken out, whether I've written it, whether I thought about it. There's a whole nother story in there. And I think that's how Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises has a part where he's talking, the character is talking about how they were injured in war. He's talking to the lady. I can't remember all the names now. And the scene is going, and then there's a semicolon, and then it starts on something else. And you're like, oh, what happened there? What happened there? I feel like we missed a whole episode of what's going on. So I'll do that if I'm just for fun. But yeah, I try not to, as the singer in Maroon 5 said, when we started, we tried to sound like everyone. And then when we got famous, we tried to sound like no one else. So that's interesting.
That's the good words. And yeah, I love that you're talking about Hemingway now, particularly there in Florida. And I'm not a specialist by any means, but I'm a big fan, and the older you get, the more you love Hemingway for sure, like Shakespeare. Just a little aside there.
Yeah, Hemingway to me is just so easy to read. And you read like A Movable Feast and you go, this is just a book about a guy in Paris, just walking around doing his normal day, doing some writing in a coffee shop, walking down by the river, meeting some people that maybe because they're other writers. That's all this is. So it has the same effect of like garage band music to me, where you can read it and go, well, I can do that. But it does seem more difficult once you start doing it, because the devil's in the simplicity of it. You don't want to describe everything to death. You want to describe it enough to where you've painted the picture, and then let the reader put the rest together.
I'm so happy to hear you say that. You're absolutely right. That mystery of what's been left behind, the economy of language, isn't it? And one of the best things about X, sort of Twitter X culture, is we often complain, us writers, about the short character limits. But the fact is, it teaches you to be disciplined, doesn't it? To get as much impact as you can out there, for it to be witty or whatever, and to have that space left between. Well, I loved what you just said about the semicolon, and there's this whole book left out or something, of two thoughts put together. How interesting. But that's exactly like the cut up you were talking about. That would give me something to think about for future.
I think the simplicity of writing too, I try to stick with that when I'm writing like just novel type stuff. I try to keep it simple enough but interesting, because you don't want to get lost on the details of a spot on the wall. But with poetry, I think I tend to take out a lot, because I don't like, one, you're trying to get that tone in the rhythm of it. And the other is you want to leave enough room for people to put their own thoughts in. So if you explain everything so precisely, then there is no room for interpretation. So I think that's one of the great things about art, that is the modern art or the impressionist art, is that the people are left to put those chips back in if they want to. And you're talking about chipping away at the poem. And yeah, that's what it is. You're trying to find it in all of that. And then somebody else can come along and say, oh, okay, I see this. It's a little different. Maybe I'd put this here and this here, and get a different experience from it. There are a few
Mm.
times I've read things, whether it's a book or a poem or a song, maybe books and poems more, where I'll read it and I'll go, well, I don't like this line, so I'm going to choose to not read it. And I don't want to insult the person that wrote it, but I'm just going to leave either the ending off. I think it ended here and not here. And then that's just how I remember it. And if I go back and read it, maybe I'll write a note in it if I have a book by it, or I'll remember and I'll go, oh, yeah, this is where I stop on this one. And
Right.
if I'm reading, this is where I stop. And sometimes with movies, I'll feel that same way where you're like, okay, this is the end of this movie and we're done. But with songs, sometimes I find it a little different than poetry. And I'm not sure how to explain it, but there are some songs where I think I need to rewrite this song because I don't like the message that's in this, but there's something there and it could be so great. And it's not like I'm going to rewrite it and publish it. It's just I'm going to rewrite it either so I can play it myself and this is the way I play it versus this is the way they wrote it. And it's just, I guess, two different takes on the same thing.
Mm.
But do you find that songs are different than poems to you?
Very much so. Actually, the whole kind of process sort of started for me with lyrics in 89, 90 or something, and putting them to punk kind of good grunge bands that I was in. So then when I stopped doing that and started to discovered Mr. Dylan Thomas basically, and discovered how to sculpt language, started then to get into the words themselves. When it comes to a song, I know that lots of people who listen to music are listening for lyrics, and I don't do that, but I do sometimes. And the more I listen, because I love music so much, that the voice becomes an instrument, it's just doing its thing, and that's the magic of pop song or songs. But then when you have an instrument that is precise, like Mr. Leonard Cohen, for example, because everything else is so sparse, the voice is an instrument in itself, and he obviously touches our two of the subjects here quite well, doesn't he? Because it's the precision, the economy, and also the fact he's expressing some deep love in there as well. So he's a good person for anyone listening to this of any curiosity, as if they haven't heard him, to have a listen to his Cohen if they're younger, because it's just how to do it. It's just a masterclass in songwriting, nuance, and once you realize what he's doing, he's not always even bothered about choruses. It's just, and when it comes to the message, as you mentioned, I don't think I've ever written a song with a message, and if I have, I've unraveled it as fast as I can and rearranged it to, because I just don't like being that on the nose, as I said.
Huh. I remember writing a song about, I was like, I need to have like a rock star song that I can play on an acoustic, kind of like a ballad, but can also be faster. And I was like, we're going to have to talk about drugs, obviously, and being on the road and living in hotels and cocaine and all this. And I was like, yeah, okay. So I wrote a song like that, having never done any of that. So that's interesting. What kind of music do you think influenced you the most?
Into starting the bands in the first place, it would be averse of me to not mention The Cure. They had a huge effect on the teenage me, and so the bands I was playing at the time. As I got older and the band themselves got older, came to 1991, Nirvana were massive. We had a massive wave of grunge from Seattle over into Britain, and we all enjoyed it very much and still do. Fantastic work, and Kurt Cobain's sort of ending of rock is what he was doing with all that. We could see it, though we tried to pull it out a little bit. He really did end it in that with a shotgun or whatever, however you want to put it. It was a real statement. So he was there very much behind the music when I wasn't very much into lyrics. And as I got older, I still kept doing the music, and Mr. David Bowie became massive because of his breadth of vision. And he had such a mixed career that I wasn't into anything from 1980 onwards. But by that time, we were 2 decades past the 80s. So I started to understand how valuable it was to do going backwards and the revision. What I love about Spotify culture, YouTube, internet culture, is the way we're allowed to go back to archive if we want, to explore an artist. I just got into someone called BC Camplight, who's a British indie guy. I don't know hardly anything about him at the moment, except for a couple of songs, and they've all been amazing. And I love discovering an artist with a handful of albums out, not millions, too much, but a handful of albums. And when every track is amazing, it's very exciting for me. Yeah, with poetry too,
Nice.
so that's much more rare.
Yeah. With poetry, I think success as a poet is if you have a book of 50 to 100 poems, however many are in your book, and somebody likes one of them, that's a success. Because it's just so hard to find. First, are people going to find the poetry? And then are they going to read enough of it to say, this is what I like and this is what I don't like? And if you get one poem that a person holds in their mind for any amount of time, usually if it's one, if they don't know the whole thing, but if they remember it so they can go back and look at it and it still means something to them, I think that's a success. Even to the point where if you had a whole poetry book and you only liked 1 or 2 lines, but you remembered them and you would quote them, then I think that's a success for that poet too. So
you're absolutely right there.
Music and poetry are different to me, and I'll have to think more about why I think they are, but we're just about the same age. And it's interesting to hear how grunge affected you in England, kind of the same way it did for me on the East Coast of the US. And I remember hearing Nirvana for the first time and then just going, it's all this stuff I was listening to before, I'm not going to be able to listen to anymore. Because and I remember the feeling, but I don't know how to explain it now. And it doesn't seem that different now. Like I can listen to Guns N' Roses and Nirvana in the same sitting and be like, okay, yeah, it's both good. But I remember when I first heard Nirvana and I was like, man, how am I going to go back to Appetite for Destruction or anything else when this is out there? And then just being able to discover the earlier Nirvana stuff, that was fun too, to go back to Bleach at their first album from Sub Pop after Nevermind was released. And that goes into that garage band thing of, this is just a power trio. I can play all of this. I can play all of this on every instrument they have, and I can do this. So it made it attainable for everyone. And then when you start looking at it and you're like, oh, okay, he's got some interesting guitar riffs he's doing here. I can get close to the sound. But yeah, it's more complicated than it sounds. But I think that's the great part of it, is it's so accessible because you go, oh, okay. And then it resonates on some level.
Yeah, no. What a perfect description of what they did. They're very simplistic approach. They're actually quite complicated or rich songs. You know, he had this wonderful voice on him, Kurt, and the chord progressions were so intriguing. And if you give me an intriguing chord progression, I'm yours. You know what I mean? If you take me somewhere I'm not expecting, but not too progressive, just more, enough to go whoa. Like with Lithium, their song Lithium, it's weird enough to be like, and then this power comes in, whoa, and it's just magic. And I think that's what the world heard at the same time, because we were all coming off Guns N' Roses, who are great too, but it was also huge and oversold to go, no, this is it, garage, though it's obviously very highly produced and marketed, but you played that down, and it was good to play it down, and it did a job, didn't it? It did a job for our certain era, which is now 30 odd years ago. So I don't, 30 exactly. I don't overgo it anymore. But anybody who doesn't know, if they just know sort of Nirvana because of a T-shirt, which there'll be a lot, because sort of the biggest T-shirt ever, I imagine. If it's only that, then go and have a listen as to why. And listen to Nevermind, because it's just an amazing record. They're all very good.
Yeah. Yeah, it's
I didn't know we were going to.
it's definitely an album that I know all the songs to. And as you were saying, if you can find a group that you listen to something they put out and you like all of them, that's something special. And I felt like that with Guns N' Roses, felt like that with a lot of the grunge stuff too, where I can even hear it now, and you can hear it in a certain order. Like if you made a mixtape of it, back in the day, you make the mixtape and you're like, oh, I remember hearing this song, and now this song should be next. And that's not what you're hearing. So now you have to go arrange your playlist that way so you can go, okay, this is what it's supposed to sound like. And yeah, Nirvana was like that. And then a bunch of those other grunge things. Like the first time I heard Soundgarden, I was like, man, this is just noise. This is like Sonic Youth. It's just noise. And then you give it a week or two and you're like, okay, I like this. You sit down with the CD booklet and you're looking through the lyrics and you're like, okay, all right, there's something more to this. And now I really like it. So it's an acquired taste. Soundgarden.
Exactly. And the best example of all those acquired tastes is the Pixies, really. I don't know if you agree with that, but Pixies are so special because they never had the degree of commercialism as any of those others you mentioned, but they inspired all of them. And arguably, they're much more insane in the sense of where on earth is Frank Black coming from, and that's exciting.
Yeah. That it mixes the art and the accessibility all together. Yeah, I do like that. The one I could never get on the bandwagon with was Sonic Youth. That's still, maybe I didn't put enough time into it, but it still just sounds like noise to me.
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I like them. They look super cool. They got everything going. But an album from beginning to end, I had listened to Goo a couple of years ago, and it's like, oh, I can't do this. It's too scabrous, and I think that's why the Nirvana kind of came in and did a more palatable version. They were cool, but not past a couple of songs.
Yeah, your album that's coming out, what kind of music are you putting out? I know I looked in your material, it said you had 6 albums, but so is this the 7th one coming out?
Yeah, you could say it's a 7th. There's also been a couple of compilations, you see, so it gets hard to count. But yeah, let's go for 7. Started in 2005 when I was living in Istanbul. Albums, and now these years later, and not doing it every year by any stretch, like every couple of years when I get around to it, like we've mentioned. This is called Caucasian Nights. It's very much a kind of collage cut up thing, very much in the theme of what we're talking about. It's very funky for me because I'm in the past more of an indie art rock strum, these chord arrangements kind of thing. I apply that to myself too. There's not much guitar on this. Okay. There's loads of found sounds. There's a couple of samples, lots of hip hop rhythms, that kind of thing. So I like to call it something between the William Burroughs and sort of G Love and Special Sauce kind of situation. To send you a copy of the thing afterwards, and you can attach it.
Okay. Yeah, I like G Love. I can get down with that.
Not a lot of people know him.
Oh yeah, I got a lot of that on my phone. I haven't gotten to the point where I just use playlists yet from like a streaming service. If I hear a song, I'll Shazam it and go, what's that song? And then I'll go look that up. And if it's a remake, I'll look for the original and listen to that. And sometimes the remakes are better than the original. Sometimes the original are better. Sometimes they're both good. But I'll do that. And then I'll try to discover the new artists. Like it seemed like when we were younger, it was easier to discover them because that was on the radio. But I guess you were just listening to what other people thought were good, and that's how you discovered them. But I still save all the songs in iTunes, and then if I like some music, I'll check it out on YouTube or a streaming service, and then I'll buy it if I like it. So just to give
that's
that money back to the artist, but I'm not sure that the artist gets much of it, but also because I feel like I've purchased it, so now I have it. And I don't think we really possess that music like we did back when we had albums and tapes and CDs, where you could lose it all on your computer, and you forget that, where am I going to find another Sea Hags album? I don't have it now. I downloaded it or uploaded it to my computer so I can listen to Half the Way Valley, but I can't find an album anywhere about it. They do have things on YouTube, but I want to give the money back to the Hags.
I'm going to have to have a listen to those after this.
Oh yeah, Sea Hags are good. Sea Hags are good.
Right. You're talking about scarcity, aren't you? Like in the past, there was scarcity value. You save up your pocket money, as we call it, and then you go and buy it, and it's a big deal, and very exciting because of that. Our generation have seen that go from one thing to another quite painfully, and I noticed that the Gen Zs have no idea what I'm talking about, and also I've got used to it now, so I don't really. I've got a pile of the CDs over there, and they're like fossils, and that's absolutely fine. The art of work of that time, what they represent, is fine. Leave them like that, because now they're all there on Spotify, YouTube, whatever, and the relationship's changed. I need to get with that, and however much change is difficult for artists or anybody else, they're working out something in the financial model. I mean, it's not perfect, like you allude to, but that shouldn't stop anybody worth their salt going for it anyway and trying to make themselves stand out. We've always had to try to make ourselves stand out. In the first punk thing in 77, 79, when we were just thoughts, it was all hard for them too. There was millions of punk bands all over Britain and America, no one really doing anything, and a couple went bang, 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 MC5, Sex Pistols, Clash, going, we're good. And so, I mean, that's a meritocracy at work there, isn't it? I don't know. I guess that's the problem, is when YouTube just chuck the money at the most controversial or the most antagonistic or the most beautiful. Those things are, and I think that's the cultural issue we got going on at the moment, and that's what I talk about in a lot of the writing I do. I don't say it's all bullshit. Am I allowed to swear on this? I don't know.
Yeah, you can.
So I don't say it's all bullshit. I just say that, ask them to think about that a bit, because it's so important. However, as I say, we've normalized something new now. So I'm trying to get with the normalization, which is what we're doing at the moment. We're absolutely capitulating to the normalization of whatever's going on, aren't we? Democratization of culture.
What's your setup for writing? Like, if you're not doing poetry, music, what's your setup for just regular writing? Where do you write? What programs do you use? Do you set time aside for it every day? How do you engage with that?
Much more lo-fi, I think. If I leave the house, I'm not online. So here at home, I've got the laptop and everything else all connected up so I can be communicable. If I leave the house, I don't have any of it. I've got a phone that isn't connected up. That's not trying to be difficult. It's understanding that accidentally I went from the house once and it was off and it felt amazing. So I'm just like, right, I'm going to make it a habit so I can go and be of the world and do things in the world. And so if I am out there and I get an idea, I write it in the notebook, which is always on me, and then structure the day, come back usually of an evening after 6 p.m. of some sort. I don't have a TV and I don't turn the TV on. I know everyone does, and I'm not going to have a go at them for that. Personally, I'm glad for not having it, because I don't go, right, I need to go and watch the Waltons. I get those ideas out of the pad into a Word thing. And if I have time, I stare at it and I go, is it moving me? And if it is, I can't help but start to edit it. And then that gives itself onto a new thought, and then bring in something. And before you know it, you're in a place where you're not thinking about work. You're not thinking about, do I think I should write a poem? You've written a poem, or you've got something in front of you that's become something, you know. So it's not that thought through, but you do have to open the program, you do have to open the book and go, do we have a moment? Don't be but I'm not afraid of it, if that's what you mean. I don't have a fear of the blank page. Just thank goodness I don't get those kind of blocks going on. Touch wood.
Yeah. It does seem like now we lived in a more dangerous time, because growing up, you didn't have a phone on you. You're just out there in the world without a leash, and anything could be happening. And now when you leave the house without your phone, I feel like I'm trying to find it. If I like left it and I go, okay, I don't have my phone. Every few minutes, I'm like, okay, I've left it at home. I left it at home. So I do try to have times now where I don't have my phone with me, but should probably do that more. Yeah. Life seems more dangerous when you're walking out in the world and you don't have your phone. You feel like if something goes wrong, you can call somebody and they'll help you. But in reality, if something goes wrong and you try to call someone, then you're probably going to get hurt in that amount of time. That's more of a thing I learned in policing, where you have your radio and you're out there on the road at 3 a.m. and you've stopped a person, or you've come across someone and you're talking with them. And if a shootout or a fight happens, it doesn't do any good to call on the radio. There's nobody that's going to be there in time to help you deal with the situation you have to deal with right now. So I remember my first few foot pursuits of trying to say where I am, but still sound calm enough while you're running, and still pay attention to is the person going to go around a corner and then get a gun, or what's going to happen? How am I going to deal with the situation that's in front of me? And then when I started doing flight school, they have a thing in flying that says aviate, navigate, communicate. So first, fly the plane. Second, fly it somewhere. And then third, you can talk to somebody about what you're doing. So I think that helped me in policing more, because I was like, okay, yeah, I just need to deal with what's in front of me right now. And if you're in a shootout, get in your shootout. When you have time, talk on the radio. But even when you have time to talk on the radio, they're not going to help you. There might be somebody on the way, but it's not going to help you. That might be a little digression from walking around in the world without your cell phone, but I do think about those things. And when I think
Fascinating. Yeah.
When I think about not having a TV, and we do have a TV now, but I watch it much less, especially after starting the podcast stuff, because this takes up a lot of time. And then you have to set that time aside for other things like taking care of the house or writing or reading. I find myself listening to podcasts more than I used to. But the picture I have in my mind is the George C. Scott Christmas story. I don't know if you're familiar with that one, where he's Scrooge.
I think I know what you mean.
Okay, he comes home to the big house. He goes through all the big hallways, and then he goes into his little room, close the door. He's got his porridge already simmering on the stove or by the fire, and then he sits down and he's just eating his potatoes or whatever. And I'm thinking, wow, that's kind of what I feel like now when I come home and I don't turn the TV on and I'm not listening to something, because it's okay to have a little bit of silence every now and then. So,
isn't it?
I do try to have those Scrooge moments every now and then where you're just not doing anything but listening to what's in your head, I guess.
Totally. It's so nicely put as well. I was watching watching a talk yesterday of Mr. Jonathan Haidt. Have you heard of Jonathan Haidt at all?
Yeah.
Maybe? Yeah. And he's concerned about the effect of the social media, iPhones, on the teens' mental health, particularly young liberal white girls are basically going crazy from social media, absolutely under anybody's radar. And he's a proper research professor. He's not mucking about. He's not trying to have a go at Apple. He's just saying what's happening. And it's just fascinating, the stats he's come up with. And that quiet time, them getting used to not judging each other all the time, judging themselves and bullying and everything else that the digital natives are going to have gone through in a way that we are basically looking at as fathers and uncles, aren't we? But trying to do our own thing within it. And they are being abused by it, or they're just having a very, very complicated relationship with that stuff, which they don't even picture as complicated. It's the normality. And it's for us to say, you can just be quiet. You don't have to have that on. I don't actually know very many young people. I'm not a teacher anymore, so it doesn't come into my world very often. I don't know how much it really is bugging them. And obviously every kid's different too. And it's not just kids, it's adults too getting that. Social media is just so powerful now. And we have to talk about it, whether every bone in our poet and painter's body is saying, ignore it. Still got to somehow deal with it. We're going to share this podcast and all the rest of it. We're trapped.
Yeah. I think that's why I like podcasts more now. It's because it seems more like you're a part of a conversation and not a podcast like a radio show where you have bells and whistles going off and music, and commercials and all that. Just a conversation. I think the art of talking to people has been pushed to the back over those quick snippets and things on social media where it just seems it'd be tough to be a kid these days, especially if somebody's trying to destroy your reputation on a medium that meets or that reaches out to so many other people. It's tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more.
Have you done, when you do any type of writing, have you done collaborative writing before? Like either written a book with someone else or song, poem, anything like that?
Not a great deal. With the music, in 2015, I recorded an album with an experimental musician called Etuspedix Butilator, who's a musician here in Sussex or on the south coast of England. And he works in sort of collage of sound, so he would come up with these sound collages, a bit like what Caucasian Nights is, but he's much more wild. So he was doing these crazy things with the lyrics I was giving to him. So that was a collaboration. I didn't have anything to do with the music on that album. Ninja Lit. Excuse my stammer. Ninja Lit. So that was 2015 record. So this is very much a follow up to that. I haven't really done a collaboration since then. I haven't had much of a chance. So, and with the writing, Dr. Michael Norton of the University of Bristol was my managing editor at Empowering the Innocent, which is he's a criminology lecturer in Bristol, and he's like a leading writer on miscarriages of justice. So I was contributing to his site on a regular basis over the last 18 months. It's kind of a collaboration because he would edit and check and give me ideas and toss album ideas between each other. So I do now and again. I don't really conceptualize it as collaboration, but it is that for sure.
What's when you work with somebody on something, does it make you, for lack of a better word, excited or happy about working with yourself?
Historically, other people haven't tended to have the degree of intensity I have with creative work. So they quite quickly step back and let me crack on. So it's, without hard feelings, it's like, all right, cheers then. So usually that's what's happened as a younger man. But with Dr. Norton and Etuspedix, they are very much of a level. So also going at their own full speed. So there's not much conversation. It's like, what are we going to get out of this, and what's the result going to be? I'm just thinking about that.
Okay. Have you gone to any writing groups, or maybe some people call them critique groups, but have you sought out anything like that?
And not that much. No, for years I've done all kinds of support. I'm a volunteer in lots of different organizations, and I'm always giving of my time and all the rest of it. Basically, lots of the people who go to such critic groups, and I'm more than happy to be proven wrong, tend to be older women talking on a certain social justice theme, which I don't share or care about. So there's a pretense of going to talk about Thomas Hardy, but you're actually going to talk about how Thomas Hardy treated his wives or something like that, for example, and that sort of stuff started to tire me out because I prefer a more red meat, politically incorrect version of art than I was being surrounded with. So that's pretty much why I stopped collaborating and just saying, this is what I do, take it if you don't, because people are always trying to co-opt you into doing something for the social good. And you're like, well, what if I don't want to do that? I often do things for social good, by the way. I just don't want my art to be around that.
It just sounds like you're going to the wrong groups, bro. Wrong groups.
Well, you're quite right with that. Yeah, for sure.
Or maybe there just aren't those groups around. Maybe that's the issue.
That too, especially on the south coast of England. I have no idea where to find them, but I'll have a look.
What do you think that you've learned by writing?
I don't know. I think I've possibly learned the fact that the content of everything that we're saying today, which is that it's not yours, it's you're the channel for whatever's happening. Yeah, maybe that. It's it's a good way to get rid of artistic ego because people can ascribe it to you, fine, if you wanna. But the fact is, I don't know where it came from, and however good you say it is, I'm not really feeling that, and that's perhaps, I don't know. It's just, but we can take responsibility for the fact that it's come from our pen and we've done the sign off. But yeah, what have I learned is that it doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to the cosmos, doesn't it? Yeah. Or the audience interpretation of it. That's what it really belongs to. Yeah.
The instrument, not the hand. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
What do you think, or what's your favorite part of writing or just creativity in general? What gives you that drive to keep doing it?
When you start something and it's okay, we've started something, and then suddenly a line or a word or a stroke or a chord change pop in from somewhere, and they give you the magic that you once would have heard in Nirvana or the first time you saw a clay, so I can be happy enough with my own stuff sometimes. I'm not that bad that I'm going, oh, everything I do is shit. I can, if I've done something well, I'm proud of it and I know it. So when a chord change pleases me, I'm delighted because it means it's going to please somebody else who might be like me or like, those kind of things. By the way, you often think about the mainstream reach. Do I want to be Beyonce? And the fact is, I don't. I want to speak to people like you and people, your listeners, people that will actually care about culture in the same way that I do. And if that happens to put me into some box, I don't think the box is that small, by the way, but if it's that box, then so be it. We're not going to reach all the 7 billion, especially when 6 billion of them think I'm some sort of a colonialist, racist, fascist bloke, because I'm English. So we're kind of, without wanting to get too political on it, we're sort of stuck in this odd place.
Yeah, it's that burden of being normally strange. Like other people, I feel like, are trying to fit in, and I'm sure everybody in their own part tries to fit in. I mean, it's a society, so we're trying to fit into it somehow. But it's also nice to be able to exercise the strangeness and seek out conversation with those people of like minds. But
yeah. Sort of, if I can just sort of add to that completely, when you come from a background like kind of the policing or something like that, and from teaching possibly, but much more policing, because you guys are not expected to be in touch with your artistic side, to the best of my knowledge. Certainly not in Britain, you know. So it's got to be applauded for that sort of thing, you know, because it's a hell of a jump for us. You don't hear about it very often.
What's your experience with that? I know you write what is the words for it? The poems of criminal justice and justice reform in the media. What's your relationship with law enforcement?
I mean, I've had some, and there's also some stuff that's under appeal right now. So I can't.
Oh,
Yeah, I've got issue. I'm very happy to come back on your show in a few months and talk about that in properness.
okay.
You know, I'm an adult. I've got stuff going on, and some stuff can't talk about. Some stuff can. But I've had doings with the police and with lawyers and with judges and all sorts. You know, that's what happens when you get to your 40s, apparently. So, but I put it all through the prism of art as well. So yeah. I'll come back on and discuss that in better detail, I promise, if you like.
Okay, yeah. Very mysterious, very mysterious. Kind of worried, but still mysterious.
Well,
how'd you get started in the editing world?
Editing world. Well, I was working for a magazine called Tour Times on Dartmoor, which is it's a moor here in Britain in the southwest. It's huge. And I was living there in 2018, and I was art and content editor of this mag, and so bringing the art that they had in there. So getting those two passions of English and art together into a magazine is exciting, and I started to understand how to do that in a design context. And so after that, I've been doing other positions, voluntary and paid, in online editing and with other various mags. And I was the editor of this the False Allegations Watch for Empowering the Innocent with Dr. Michael over the last 18 months, which is story selection, proofreading, all that kind of thing. So yeah, trying to pull all those criminal justice, art, English, poetry into one direction, I suppose.
Do you find that the editing mind is different than the writing mind?
Yeah, but because it's all entirely then about the audience, as opposed to partly creator and partly audience. So when it's the editor, you're just like, how is this going to be received? And you have to give that bad news or whatever else to the provider and say, look, it's not about you, John. It's just the piece of work is fine, because they always think you're giving them a kick in the teeth just because it can't be put out at that time, you know, but it's not their fault. And do you become a wet nurse for them when it comes to that, or you just bang it out anyway, you know? So that kind of thing. It's yeah, having to think about what the audience will think as opposed to the creator.
With your public speaking, did that come before or after the editing?
I started that in Istanbul before. In 2013, I gave a TED talk when I was out there called Stammering and Creativity. It's about stammering, which is a thing that I know about, and creativity too, like as we're talking about. So I banged them together for this TED talk at the end of the 10 years of teaching English and cultural studies out there. So I did that first, and because as a stammerer, as a son of a drama lecturer, I've always wanted to be involved in public speaking somehow or other, in poetry. But still, I'm not entirely sure that's for me, but it's a part of what we do in a way. And then I gave a talk at Istanbul University, and I came back to Britain and gave a couple more of those talks, Stammering Creativity, here in various places, and then became the editor in 2018. So started to pull all those English things together at the end of the last decade, I guess.
Okay. What are the top things that you use to decide if your talk was successful? Like, what are the top 3 things that you'd say this, it happens and this, it makes this, I feel good about, this is a successful public speaking engagement?
Oof. I don't think I've done about maybe sort of 15 max, in a sense of if it's classroom teaching, hundreds, but public speaking is slightly, it's not dissimilar, but it's different.
Yeah.
I've never felt good about it afterwards. I've just put it out and gone, I hope that's all right. I don't overthink it. I just do it with those things, because there's bits of stammering, there's bits of hoping for the best, but the feedback's always really good. So maybe it's people just being polite. I don't know.
What about with teaching then? What makes, after a class taught, what's the difference between that didn't go well and this was good?
The engaged faces, I didn't get disruptive students or anything, because within a couple of minutes, they're just like looking at you, not looking at each other, being bored and all the rest of it. I don't know. I used to do the lesson plans and all the rest of it. But I think because I'm very, very much into it, I love English very much, and the cultural stuff I was talking about, they seem to start to love it too, or to at least really enjoy what I was doing. So when the classes were good, how many hours of teaching I did, many, I would just go on the basis of, well, I've got that done. And then when the student came in the next time and said what he'd remembered, it's like, oh, right, well, I must have had some part in that, so there's a kick in that. So, I didn't kind of do too much of the overthinking of teaching, though, because I'm not that kind of a professional to overthink what I do. I just do it, hope for the best.
Okay.
Careless.
Well, it's nice to feel like somebody understands what you're saying, like, especially if you're teaching a class, that somebody got something out of it and didn't feel like it was a waste of time. That's a nice feeling. I would say that's a success.
Absolutely. No, you're quite right. Yeah. Just like you were talking about the poem earlier, if one person gets it, you've actually succeeded. That's my degree of success as well, with almost all of this stuff in this cultural environment where it's hard to get noticed. If one person goes, Sean, I loved that. Good. Thanks for pointing it out. Thanks for telling me what you liked.
Maybe there's a little difference between, like, what's his name? That was the mayor of New York during the lockdowns, where he said, if one person gets saved, this will be worth it. So maybe for the poetry, the success, if you put out a book and one person goes, I liked it, maybe that's a type of success. But I was more saying, if people that read it find one poem that they like, then that's a success. So I don't know if that's a little different, but yeah, it's good to know that you, oftentimes when you're doing art, maybe not often, but sometimes you have that moment where you go, what am I doing? What am I doing this for? Like, I don't, maybe not so much with writing or poetry, because even if I didn't publish it, I would still do it. But more of like podcasting, I have thought a few times, what's going on here? What's the end to this? What's the purpose? But I think the purpose is, are you talking to strange people? Because I like talking to strange people. So are you talking about creativity? Are you having a good conversation that you wouldn't have had otherwise? Well, then maybe it's good to keep doing it. So
yeah,
that's
absolutely. It's a very strange new ecosystem out there of attaching certain things to certain things. And one way or another, people who like what you and I do will be watching this, and we don't quite know how it works. So I don't pretend to, but I know that's what they're doing. So with a bit of luck, they'll get a bit of the soul juiced for themselves. I don't know.
Yeah. Then you always think, what if society collapses and this is the only thing that the aliens find thousands of years from now, like the pyramids and then this, and they're like, man, look at, this is what this culture was all about. It puts a perspective on history, the way we look at it, and we see a few things and think we understand, or we have this expansive view of history. But it would have been nice to have been able to see what was in the library at Alexandria instead of just imagine all the things that were lost in it.
I hope that the future aliens will have access to this channel, be able to see what we're on about. Have to touch a finger, you know.
Yeah. What's the best way for people to follow your work, to be able to find your music and your art?
Okay, if they go to Google, of course, the Overlord, and put in the Sean B.W. Parker, that's spelt there with an SEAN,
Okay.
they'll see they'll see the X. So if they want to do the news, I'm quite busy on X. They can go there, and if they want my books, go to Amazon. That will be right underneath it, and a couple down there'll be Spotify, where they can hear all my albums. Next one out next week. So yeah,
Okay.
that's the best places for it.
All right. I'll get those links and put them in the show notes so people can go directly to them. Any thoughts you have in closing? I've enjoyed our conversation.
It's been a little journey across 20th century culture. Hemingway, Nirvana, and the other dudes that we've been talking about, and some women. I'm sure we've mentioned some. It's really good fun.
Pixies.
Thank you. Pixies, absolutely. Pixies.
Yeah, Kim Dill. Okay. All right. I'll talk to you on the other side of this. Okay.
Okay. Thanks, man.